Welcome. So wonderful to see you here. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful day. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 805th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the immense pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation featuring Chakaia Booker, David Nolan, Phil Sanders, Leanne Norman, and Tom McGlynn. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Taonga Leslie here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and hosts. Chakaia Booker is a New York-based artist. She's best known for her pioneering use of recycled rubber tires as a raw material for making abstract sculpture, often at a monumental scale. Booker merges ecological concerns with explorations of racial and economic difference, globalization, and gender. The artist's works are contained in more than 40 public collections and have been exhibited across the US, Europe, and Asia. David Nolan is an Irish gallerist who specializes in modern and contemporary art, and in 1987, he opened David Nolan Gallery. Phil Sanders is a collaborative master printer, author, educator, and artist. Sanders founded and directs P.S. Marlowe, a fine art publishing and print publishing and consulting firm based in Asheville, and recently authored Prints and Their Makers. He's also a frequent collaborator of Chakaia Booker's. Writer and strategist Leanne Norman is based in New York and loves to tell good stories about the arts in our everyday, and we are lucky to have her as an ArtSeen editor at the Brooklyn Rail. And artist, writer, and independent curator Tom McGlynn is based in the New York area. He is an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail and currently has an exhibition on view called What Gives at Rick Wester Fine Art, New York. Thank you all so much for joining us in the NSE today, and I'm so excited to pass it over to you, Leanne, to get us started.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you all for joining us today. Really excited about the conversation and to talk a little bit more about Chakaia's practice and this incredible show. Maybe we can just kind of dive in. Chakaia, you have been working with tires as well as other materials for quite some time, and I wonder if you could share with us a little bit the origins of that. In the 1980s, you were wandering around, there were lots of tires everywhere. What inspired you to use them and then start incorporating them into your work and practice?
Well, back in the 80s, there were lots of retreads all over. Every weekend, there were car fires, and tires would be smoldering and burning. I think looking at the texture, looking at the movement of the material, I started collecting the scrap material and began making wearable art pieces. At some point, I started switching into creating sculptural pieces as well. And then doing my master's degree at City College, I started making large scale works for public art.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Your work also, kind of explores issues of the human condition as well. I think some of those themes kind of come up in the work that you make. And I think it's really interesting to kind of compare the issues that you explore in your work with the material of tires itself. Can you share a little bit with us as well about some of the themes that you address in your work, some of your public works, and we'll be getting into some more specifics about what's in the show later, but maybe generally, if you could share about the themes and the relationships of the material that you're using to express them.
Well, I think looking at some of the material, I began to think about the works, thinking about scarification that happens in Africa, thinking about the mobility as far as how things move, as far as the material as far as used in transportation, but also just thinking in terms conceptually about how things can go up or down for the culture. I think about the patterns that you see on the treads are similar to the patterns that you would see in some of the prints that you see in the fabrics, and also other sculptural pieces, and as far as how they design and create work.
Thank you. I wonder if we can also kind of bring in your collaborators a little bit. David, you're you know, kind of organizing the show that covers you know, decades of Chakaia's work. Can you talk to us a little bit about what interests her work, I'm sorry, for you, why you wanted to work with her, and a little bit about putting the show together, perhaps?
Well, I've known Chakaia's work for, as many people have, both museums and public spaces over the years, and her work always stood out as being totally unique from the use of materials, the layering that she does with the tires. I mean, I would say one of the biggest things always to me is the mystery of the objects. They almost have a spiritual-like quality, but the layering and the use of tires and recycling tires was something that nobody else had done in any way that looked like hers. I mean, I had clearly some African associations and even Asian associations with military armor and all of those types of things. But there was, you know, when you look at her sculptures, there's nobody else who makes sculptures like hers. Sure, there are people, you know, John Chamberlain, there could be many other artists who have used car parts and things, but hers has been something that was very different. And I thought when we were going to do a show together, in the context of the gallery where we show both for contemporary artists and classical artists like Barry LeVay and Richard Archbarger and all of those, I felt that her voice was both a very contemporary new voice, as well as they have a great classic sense to them, the sculptures. And the other idea in talking to Chakaia that I thought would be fantastic to juxtapose a room installation, which turned out to be 2 rooms. She invaded my office as well as the gallery space, but to have a big installation together with individual pieces laid out in the other parts of the gallery, so that the installation aspect really draws you in, and it's an immersive piece of art. You walk through it, there's actually a doorway in the middle of it, and they are modular. The system, the way they're put together, is a modular system, so it can be adjusted to any type of interior architectural space. And ours, she started in my office and then led into the other room diagonally through the space. And as when you look through the sections of it, you can see how the modular system works, the layering of the tires, and then these spikes. It's amazing the amount of effects she can make just by cutting the normal cutting through of the tires. There are so many different effects. And then when you get into the individual pieces, there's such a range of options and tools, because she, as in the early days when she used tires, you can see in some of the elements there's a metal blade, or there's a shovel, or there's an element from farm equipment that she has come across and incorporated in the pieces. So there's a huge range of rhythm and types of objects that go into the making of it. But it was very important, as I say, to have an installation together with individual pieces to really give people a sense of what an important and versatile artist Chakaia is.
I like what you mentioned, David, about the modularity. I was thinking about that when I was doing research for the talk, and there are artists like one of Chakaia's mentors, Al Loving, whose early work focused on modularity. I think we have an example, Eleanor, at the back. That last slide. So here's a very early Al Loving, wonderfully titled Rational Irrationalism. But I was thinking about Al Loving and also Tony Smith, who also grew up in East Orange, like Chakaia. So there's that connection. I agree, David. I think that there is this presiding, very strong. I almost hesitate to say classical, because I think that, you know, Chakaia, like Tony Smith, seems to be involved in how things grow organically too. Like there's an incredible paradox with this material that's so industrial, but they're growing in this very organic way through the artist's hands.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. I think the layering aspect is an essential part to everything I see around Chakaia. And I would say almost to sort of paging Phil, the drawings and the prints that she's made, the layering of all the chinkole that she does again, it's about modularity, it's about layering in a way that gives her an amazing amount of freedom. The pieces can be any scale, but what she has done with Phil Saunders, I think, is astounding in how the two of them have pushed that medium of using chinkole and the collage aspect, the layering aspect of what she has done.
Yeah, for me, I'll chime in. I have a little one who just woke up from a nap. So sorry, guys, I was gone for a second. But so one of the things that's really great for me, and having worked with Chakaia over the years with work in this modular format, is that there's literally no difference in her approach to making work in prints or painting or sculpture. It's all the same creative approach. It's really just a matter of means of output. And, you know, modularity, and Chakaia, you've talked about this a lot, came out of a, you know, necessity, out of invention. You know, studio spaces not being big enough to make large work that you could get back out of it, and, you know, became a format or a process for you to take a mark or a gesture and be able to repeat it when it came to the prints. And for us, having worked together for about 15 years doing print work, the thing that has always reigned true is that the marks that you arrive at are never locked into a place. You know, I think that's something really important to distinguish the way you worked and, say, a regular painter or even a regular printmaker, where a mark where you put it is where it stays generally. A mark for you or a gesture for you is really something that can be then repeated. It can be moved, it can be shortened, it can be expanded, it can have its own life and reinterpret itself. And I think the way in which you approach your sculpture is the exact same way in which you approach the creative process for making your prints, which is fairly rare amongst artists. And it's you've used it as a form of invention, just the same way you've invented a way to utilize rubber as a raw material. You've done the same for your chinkole processes in print.
I agree. The modularity was really important. But I think maybe it's for me, when I look at your work, Chakaia, maybe it's the rubber materials, or if you're using bronze or that sort of thing as well. There's so much fluid movement in it as well. And I think it just kind of transforms the material into something else. Like I understand that what I'm looking at, but it kind of lends itself to being something else, or it has sort of a different sentiment that it evokes for me because of the modularness, the flow and movement within your works as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about, you know, as I think your collaborators were just talking about working across different mediums. How do you consider that approach when it comes to expressing ideas? Your work titles as well are really interesting to me. They also kind of have another layer of invoking sentiment as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about working across different medium, how you consider titles for your work, either of those?
Well, titles can come anytime. There's no rule. I mean, it can come when the shipper is grabbing it out of my hands and ready to put it on the truck, or it could be going down to the gallery for an opening. It could be something that came about before the work was actually completed. I met an artist once and she was interesting. She said every time she went to bed, she would think of a sculpture and a title. And I just thought, okay, I'm not that good. But I think that it's channeling into the work, being able to be open enough to, receive the information. And once I make that sort of contact, I just sort of hold on to it. So even if it's not something I can use at the moment, I'll store it away for another time, or it could be something that just sort of happens. And I'm just aware that this is the right thing for it. Even if it's a group of works working together and there's one major title, something may come up and say, no, I want to be titled this. And that this comes just from just being open and as a channel to developing and creating the work. When I first saw the tires, many years ago, it was just being a person like anybody, trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives. And I observed people, seeing the different things they were doing, seeing everybody's individual techniques and personalities. And some people would like to be working around crowds and other people would need to be closed in. So it was just observing and just seeing, how people functioned. I think for myself, once I saw the tires, I just knew it was something I wanted to work with, and I just never looked back. So all of the energies, and so for myself, I get up every day and I sculpt myself first. I start with myself. And then afterwards, I go to the studio and I continue that energy and creating the work. So the works are abstract, conceptually sort of formatted and designed. And I can say I am very happy that I allowed myself to go down this path. I think it was about making a commitment, not looking back for something else, but just moving forward always toward trying to find ways to express and extend the possibilities of what could happen. I think the subtle things that artists experience are very important. We don't always get the big bangs all the time, but then when you get that little something, you don't know if you can use it now, it'll be something later, something you direct that energy toward. But it's been a very interesting journey.
That's wonderful. Getting back to the material, I know a lot of people have made maybe more of a point of it to the detriment of maybe the form, but they're the same. I mean, and I was thinking about artists that used like ruins and recycled materials, and I thought about Robert Smithson, and there's a piece that he did called Line of Wreckage from, I think it's from 1968. Yeah, so the interesting thing for me about your work in relation to Smithson is like, it's not necessarily formally related, but conceptually it is in terms of location. He assembled this work from like a broken concrete highway. And there's something about the history of that materiality that is not high art. And there's kind of an attitude, I think, that from my perspective anyway, that you share with an artist like Robert Smithson about bringing things very like close to the bone in terms of your concept and your material. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, it's interesting working with the materials, discarded materials, because you have their placements as far as just thinking about the tires, how they were worn. Some people make short stops, right? And so what I get as far as my palette, and I think about a painter has color, the color is their energy that they use for their palette. My palette is the textures, movements of the materials, but each one varies. You know, so each one that you get is not exactly the same. So that kind of associating the things that you find and how you can see into what is there is what you end up needing to work with. So it's the dialogue works both ways, as far as me coming in with a particular intent on what I think I'd like to do. And then whatever the materials that I have available, which they do vary every year. Whatever is there, I'm listening, I'm seeing, I'm feeling, you know, to understand what it's able to allow me to do with it. So, so yeah, I could see similarities in thinking about the discarded materials that the artist worked with.
I love your metaphors of the left and right turn, or like, you know, the sudden stop. It's so redolent of like the highway and movement. And I think it was William Burroughs who said, in America, if you're not moving, you're dead. So it's so interesting how you sublimate all of that into your work. For me, from my perspective, that movement, that restless forward movement, and you know, the association of the highway and the tire.
Yes, and then of course, starting with the manufacturer and what they were doing to it to help to create whatever this product is, but then being able to take it from the manufacturer, from the people, whether it was one owner, two owners who utilized the material, and then for me to deconstruct it into something else is interesting.
Right, because it has that history of, I'm sorry, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say there are so many subtle variations that are there, and only until you have your hands on that you begin to recognize what those things are and be able to understand how to use them.
Right. I was just going to add that it has that history of colonialism because, you know, I mean, mostly tires are synthetic rubber, but like the rubber plantation thing is, you know, it's the history of that is about colonial exploitation. So in a way, you're taking that and sublimating that to some degree too. I'm not saying consciously, but it's just there in the material, which is another aspect of your work I find really fascinating.
But the use of the material and the patterns that are inherent in the tires themselves, and the way she puts them together, the repetition also, because I mean, there's so much movement within the pieces, partly from the repetition of the shapes and the forms, but also the pattern in the tires, which Chakaia alluded to, scarification, and of course, yes, the whole history of the patterns and where that comes from. And indeed, to your point about the colonial aspect of tires, of course, if they're still made, Brazil and Africa still produce a lot of tires, and there's colonialism has not stopped over in those countries. It's still very much to this day where they get paid absolutely nothing for their their week's wages. But no, I think even outside all of the political ramifications, I think the tires themselves and the movement and rhythm that she has is really very unique. And as Chakaia says too, depending on the type of tire and how they're made, you can mold them, change them, move them in different ways. They have certain ways they will move with you and other cases that they won't. But the movement is a very important aspect. There's an inherent sort of quiet grace to them, but at the same time, quite an aggressive movement and rhythm to the pieces.
I really appreciate the notion that I think you're alluding to a little bit, Chakaia, in terms of the back and forth, kind of the dialogue. You know, you're responding to the material is responding to you. You know, kind of thinking through that as well with, you know, the titles, how they just sort of come, you know, like these responsive sorts of things. It all feels very intuitive. And do you sort of take that same approach when you're working with a like site specifically or things like that, or when you're thinking about other materials instead of the rubber tires, for example?
I think that any material that I work with requires the same balance, texture, movement, form. When you're working with two-dimensional work or the three-dimensional work, it takes the same energy to process through getting to that end result. So you're still looking for the same things. You're looking for the balance. You're looking for the texture. You're looking for the movement. You're looking for the color. You're looking for all of those things that will help to understand, to understand when something is complete. So it doesn't, so if I'm making sculpture, I don't get off light because I'm making a drawing or a print. It still takes the same kind of energy.
Yeah, and Chakaia, I think that's something that having worked with you for so long really comes through in your process working with the prints, because the tires produce a certain amount of pattern and a certain amount of kind of inherent pathway or gesture towards the way you work with those materials. Whereas with your paintings, which are more collaged papers and painted material, and your prints, which are sheen collaged, you're still searching and finding the pattern and the movement. You're still finding a way to recombine those materials. And I think it's pretty easy to get seduced by the rubber because it has such a tactility and such a life of its own as a material. But I think it's really important, especially to highlight with this exhibition, which clearly shows it, that you really carry that same approach of finding and discovering through all the materials. You know, as someone who's worked with you for so long, one of the things that I'm continually amazed by is how the smallest piece can become the most integral part of a work, and how you'll save parts and pieces for years, looking for the right moment for that small gesture or that small color or that small texture to become the dominant or a supportive element, and how your eye works. And I think, you know, as people get a chance to see this exhibition and live with your work a little bit, I think they'll see that same artistic approach. It's more of a way you see the world, and how any material in your hand will still get that same treatment. I think, you know, it's easy to get lost in the rubber because you've invented a new way to use it as a raw material. And it does bring a lot of other conceptual things to the table. But at the end of the day, you know, it is about the way in which you build and the way you put things together and the uniqueness that you approach it. And so for me, I think, you know, it's really wonderful that in this exhibition, you're able to see that diversity of the way you use material for that same end.
The prints are wonderful in person because you can really see the layering. David was going through them with me in terms of how many layers. Actually, it's not evident in the slides, but they're incredibly layered. So it's a tour de force in terms of printmaking technique as well, but totally reflecting what you said, Phil, Chakaia's process.
And, Chakaia and I, when we first started working with one another, we both had the same goal, which was to quote unquote, make something flat, to really allow Chakaia to express these other creative ideas that she had that, rubber wasn't the right way to do it. Sculpture wasn't the right way to do it. And one of the things that she and I talked a lot about in the beginning is, I looked at her work, her sculpture in particular, as being kind of drawings in the round. It has that very beautiful graphic gestural quality to it, which you don't often see in sculpture. The front of a sculpture doesn't, indicate at all what the rear view of that sculpture. It's unpredictable in that way. And I think that sense of spontaneity, that's liveliness and life that comes in Chakaia's sculpture really comes through in the print work as well, because they just, as you say, they layer and layer and layer. We've done some prints together when we first started doing them at the Robert Blackburn printmaking workshop, which is a program of the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts back in 2009. Some of them are, 200 pieces of paper in a single work. They could be very small, very large, be 7, 8, 9 layers of paper thick. And so, there's a great playfulness to it. And at the same time, there's also, all of those lessons learned in those years making sculpture are directly applied into those graphic works as well. It's just like in this particular material, you see the blind embossing. And what that is a wood block that she's carved, where normally you'd be printing the upper surface and you'd see the black, but wherever the paper is pushed down into that wood block, it will push the paper in there, lifting it up, giving you that raised texture. And that white on white embossment has a really nice kind of opposites resonance to the black on black texture of the sculpture. So when you see them together in combination, you get a much wholer picture of Chakaia as an artist.
Excellent point. I like what you said about play, Phil. That, that's an aspect of art making that often gets, relegated to something that's not serious. And, it's interesting. We were talking just before we went on air about people potentially climbing that installation in the gallery. Maybe we can go to that image, Eleanor, of the large installation. And so Chakaia, you did something similar, not similar in form, like there was a similar kind of modular form that you created for a show in Newark in 2019 called Serendipity. And again, when I was doing research for the talk, I noticed that like kids were climbing on it and stuff, and there was public engagement. So I just was wondering if that's something that you're interested in, or what was your reaction when you had that kind of public literal interaction with your work?
Well, I think that most people are very eager to get on the tires. I mean, tires, you would think about a string or a rope and the kids would be jumping and swinging on them. Places where they would have tires where people could sit on them. So it's something that's very familiar. I think that most of the sculpture people are very interested in wanting to have hands-on and touch. The piece that was Serendipity that was installed in Newark is a piece that people can physically get on. So that's okay. But I think that most of the works that are outdoors, if you look online, you probably will find lots of people, not only kids 5, 6, but you can see adults 30 plus up, who physically, get on the work and like to climb and jump on them, sit on them. So Socrates Sculpture Park, they allow people to get on the sculpture, or at least they did at one time, and to have work out there and to have people moving from one sculpture to the next was something that was very interesting. And then you make it sculpture in other locations where they don't necessarily allow you to have hands-on. So I think it's very acceptable to be able to, have people interact and have hands-on. And then depending on what, especially with the steel belted, they do have a little prickiness on the edges, but it's something that some people like to feel, the texture of that, and other people don't. But yeah, public art is made so that people can have access.
That's one of the wonderful things about it, right? So I think Fong would call it social sculpture. Picking, yeah.
Yes, and that's why with in places where you do have public art, you do want to make sure that it's something that people can have access. No, excuse me.
It's wonderful. It's a wonderful aspect of that part of art making in public, making public art that can be engaged in that way.
No, yes, it is. And there's usually lots of picture taking. Lots of people will stand by looking at the work and not always knowing that it's actually tire.
Interesting.
Yes. I think I really appreciate that aspect of the work as well. Like it's the strange contradiction in a sense, as you mentioned with that one, it's a little bit spiky. Some people might like that, others may not, but they do really have an inviting kind of feeling to them of, get closer, explore, because there is so much detail and modularity and movement within them. So that's really exciting. And I feel like it really draws me in when I see the work. You also have some, there are some bronze pieces. We've talked a little bit about the prints as well. I wonder if we can, there's one we can discuss. Can you talk to us a little bit about working in this way, kind of how those ideas translate from material to material in a work such as Fluent here that we see on the screen?
Fluent is a bronze piece, and I guess back in 2002, I got an opportunity to work with a foundry, and this was initially created from wax, and then they then were able to create it into this particular work. It was interesting. I think a little more expensive to create, but it was a nice opportunity, and would like to have more opportunity to create more bronze pieces. For those who are out there listening.
And sometimes, as in this is sort of classical bronze, but sometimes the patina is also blacker, close to the tire.
That
color.
is true. Yes, the patinas, of course, can come in any color that you want, and
any scale.
yes. But it was a nice way of having, again, that conversation, abstract conversation, moving the material around. Working in wax was interesting to see, and also interesting to see how it was actually replicated almost very close to what it was initially.
Where did you fabricate it? Where did you have it fabricated, Chakaia?
Let's see. I'll get there. It's been a while.
Right.
Oops.
Yes. I'll come back to that.
Right. In America.
Yes. What's our top places? Doing bronze.
It's a difficult piece to cast, I would assume, because it's so it's so much like your assemblage, you know, it seems like it would have to be somebody who really knew what they were doing for sure.
Alex. Yeah, and also the amazing, as Chakaia said, the detail in it. And on the left-hand side, those twirly spiraled shape is really totally in the real. You see it even more three-dimensionally. So it's not clunky in any aspect at all. There's great detail in all aspects, in the front and the sides and the back.
No, it's a beautiful piece.
And then in the show, we also, of course, have ceramic pieces, and Chakaia worked with ceramic very early on in her career. So we have one particular ceramic piece, which I think you have a photo of there, which is again made in layers. Yes.
23.
And you can see there's the bottom layer that's put together with wire holding the elements together, and then you build each layer on top of it. And of course, then when it's finished, it has an undulating, it's a very human-like quality to it. No, but there are numerous, and they become much larger as well in some cases. This is a smaller one, 24 inches, 21 inches, but they've been up to 6 feet or so.
Yes. And I started in ceramics back in the 80s, doing an apprenticeship here in the city. So starting off with pots and bowls, making more utilitarian type ware, and then going from that to wearable pieces and then to sculpture.
Yes, because that wearable aspect in the ceramic you also did in the rubber. So
it is, I think, in most of even the discarded found materials outside of rubber, I started again, just picking up things from the city streets, because I started creating things that I would wear, more wearable art pieces. I would always, whatever material that I would start working in, I would make something that was wearable, then turning into sculpture.
So it's a process of translation.
I guess it's just.
I don't know, Chakaia, would you call it more of a process of like inspiration? Because you know,
Yeah,
how color came into your prints was more of a, you know, you seeing things and observing things in the studio, and how that then ends up filtering into the other work. I feel like that's really your process in a lot of ways, is that observation and how those things then filter in, you know, finding.
Getting up and then working on myself. So it sort of comes back to, with any of the materials, it starts with something that starts with me as a personal item, and then becomes something that's translated into, well, for the ceramics, the pots and bowls, but then into sculpture. And then with the tires, again, wearable pieces that I could wear, and then into sculpture.
What were the colors on this, either Phil or Chakaia? Like, are these oil-based inks?
In this case, yes, those would be oil-based inks for lithography.
Mm-hmm.
So Chakaia's general process is either hand painting on a piece of mylar that can be exposed to a lithographic plate or a screen or a silk screen, or hand carving wood blocks. And then those are printed with oil-based ink for lithography, and woodcut, and water-based inks for screen print. And so oftentimes what you're seeing is either black or white ink being printed on colored paper, either black paper or in this case, buff paper, like kind of brown buff paper. So you'll see a wide variety of use in that. Recently, we've started printing with colored ink as well, but that's very new, actually. So all that color and dynamism you see generally comes from the paper itself.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I noticed one of the prints, I'm not sure if it was a print or a drawing, but there's a bunch of color in the top. Maybe we can take a look at that, Eleanor. Is this a newer one? I guess it is. Yeah.
That's a small painting.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, so this was really interesting to me in terms of that introduction of that kind of riotous color.
I mean, Chakaia, you want me to tell the story how color ended up in your prints?
Why not?
So,
Yes.
Chakaia and I started working together when I was the director of the Robert Blackburn printmaking workshop, which is, a storied historic print shop founded by Bob Blackburn back in 1948. And it's a vibrant community-based print shop that has a lot of artists from all over the world working in it. And some of you may be familiar with M.F. Hussain. He was one of the more prominent artists from India, Muslim artists from India. And he was in the studio working on some very colorful Sheen Calais lithographs. So black and white drawing with very bright colored papers. And Chakaia and M.F. Hussain struck up many conversations. And when he had left and went back to London and there was editioning happening, Chakaia asked me if there was any of Hussain's colored paper left, because she said, I have an idea. And so we started printing her wood blocks on these colored pieces of paper. And I remember, distinctly, it was the yellow that came through first. And there was a particular mark that Chakaia had made with a grinder across a wood block that had this beautiful character to it. It was, very lively. And when we printed that on some yellow, she just asked, can I have like 20 or 30 of those? And I think that's really, indicative of her creative process. It's like that mark was really great. It was on a much larger block with lots of other marks, but it was that particular mark that she isolated. So then we ended up giving her tons of those, and those became the foundations and elements of other works. And so what you see here in this painting is a direct offshoot of, print work and how printmaking influences painting, and then painting comes back to influence prints. And you can really see a lot of the same kind of form and flow and movement that's in the sculpture also in this painting as well as in the prints. And so, for me, it's always fun working with an artist when you get to introduce something new or you get to help them see something different. And that's really what I was talking about before, where, one of the things I've always appreciated about Chakaia and her work is her keen sense of observation and her patience. She'll notice something and it'll sit there for a long time until it's ready. And when it's ready, it's really ready. It's ready to go. And it's a pretty big privilege to get to be part of that process from my perspective.
I think there is a wonderful atmosphere at Bob Blackburn set up. His spirit in that communal print shop. My wife, Tanesh Weber, actually was working there a few months ago and met Chakaia, just coincidentally. And she had similar experiences where, like leftover ink would be there and like people would experiment with the leftover ink. So it was really a very real creative community. And that's a real amazing legacy that Bob Blackburn set up there.
Right. And I mean, for me, my role at that time was a steward of his vision. And it was really about maintaining Bob's purpose for the workshop, which was to allow artists to not only work with one another and learn from one another, but artists of varying skills and experience and ages and cultural backgrounds. I mean, he really truly believed in art as the international language that we can all understand. And he always used to say, if you're an artist, you can speak to another artist. And if you can both do printmaking, you can have a more detailed conversation, through hand gestures and pointing. You didn't need it. And in an environment like that, there's so many people taking risks with their work. Printmaking really lends itself to that. And I think it helps inspire and engender that risk-taking, to spread to others. And I know Chakaia's had a major effect on many artists coming through the studio, and it's been, for me, it was a really wonderful aspect of the community side of the print shop when Chakaia was in the studio, because there's this patience and this persistence of getting things right that I think really helps inspire other artists to keep pushing themselves, so it's not just the fact that the work is beautiful, but it's also that it's this crazy labor intensive process of making something look effortless and fluid in its final presentation.
Right.
Yes, and just kind of keeping an eye on the time here. We are going to be shifting into our Q&A in just a moment. So if you do have a question, you could drop that in the chat and we'll, as Carolyn mentioned, we'll pass you the virtual mic. But sort of to wrap up our conversation, this aspect of it, I'm wondering, Chakaia, this exhibition, spans many decades of your career. It shows, lots of different ways that you engage material, different ways that your ideas express themselves and things like that. Your different approaches, sort of how it translates and is in dialogue with materials and different aspects of your work and practice. I wonder, is there any particular work in the show that might be a fave or is sort of special to you in this moment? Perhaps, what you had to go through to make it. We heard a little bit of stories of how we got to some color in your work. Is there anything that you want to reflect on in the show before we go to Q&A?
Well, I think that each work has its place as far as how it came into be and the where and why. And I think it's important to keep them all at the same level of importance and interest, because each one just offers, just something about how I got to be where I am.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Carolyn, I think maybe we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. It's such a beautiful and moving show, and I'm just so happy that we have been able to hear more about it. We do have some questions from the audience, and the first one is going to be from Ellen. Ellen, I'll give you the opportunity to unmute if you'd like. You should be able to unmute.
Got it. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Chakaia, I really enjoy your work, first of all, and I became more intimately familiar with it when you were setting up at Storm King. And it was really a delight to see you work there with your crew. So I have a question. I just wanted to know, how did you arrive at using other objects, especially shovels, in your work? And what was that? Can you remember a moment? Because sometimes as artists, there's a moment that just stays with us and I don't know why. But did you have that kind of moment that you said, or was it very natural where it just says, I see that object, I like it, I'm putting it in?
There probably is no particular rule. I mean, I think probably both of what you offered is an idea. It probably happens. I mean, something like the shovel, I probably saw it and said, okay, I'm gonna take this and keep it and put it someplace so that I could remember to use it. Or it could have been that moment of just finding it again and saying, oh, let me use it. So there's no one way. I think both can happen, but it probably, that shovel was probably something that I had for some time. And while making the work, given the studio being where it is and what it is, with so much stuff everywhere, I probably just sort of, had an eye and saw it and wanted to use it and put it in work.
Thank you so much for that question, Ellen. And thank you, Chakaia, for that response. Our next question will be from Lynn.
I thank you all for this great conversation. I was struck from the beginning to end of this presentation of this tenderness that seemed to exist between you and your materials. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, every day I walk by and I'm looking. I'm going through the studio working on a particular thing, but I'm casting an eye or walking by or looking down at something. And it is something that's sort of personal as far as wanting to care for them, to be able to make sure that they're utilized in the right way. Because I work with discarded materials, you don't always get something. If you really see something that you really would like to use, you want to cultivate it a little bit, you know, to keep it so that you have that right moment to be able to use it. So, well, it's interesting because you have to find homes for them. You have to be able to store them and keep them. So they can be expensive to have homes with lots of tires and you know, waiting for that time to be able to utilize them. But thank you so much for sort of seeing, you know, that aspect of myself in the work.
Thank you.
Where are you?
Quite a backdrop.
Yes. Oh, you're in Greece. Is that what you said?
I don't know. Yes. An amazing backdrop.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that question. That was great. And thank you, Chakaia. Our next question will be from our friend GE.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eleanor, Tom, Leanne, and Phil, and of course, Chakaia. I want to ask, do you see your work as a kind of floating garden in that it lingers in its own space and the spaces it's in, taking on sort of an improvisational sense of aesthetic ensembling, and that's really no simple kind of return to an imagined or ordinary singularity?
Floating garden, interesting.
Because the reason I ask it in that way is I hear so much of it is so akin, I'm watching it and I'm seeing it so akin to music, especially a lot of free jazz and stuff. So that's where I kind of come from.
Well, the work is something that could be interpreted for everyone and however they would like to enjoy it. And hopefully you come back to it more than once so that whatever your experience was at one point can be something similar or something different. But hopefully there is that exchange with it.
I mean, I was going to say, for me, it's almost like they're individual people. They have their own sort of life and spirit to themselves and their own way of being in the world, and the way you live with them is kind of how you live with another person. They have a very human quality in their own individuality. You know, they seem like a large family, you know, but even, you know, every painting, every print, every sculpture has its own identity and its own personality in that really kind of human way. I think that might be some of what you're responding to. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chakaia and Phil, and thanks to our special guest Phil as well for chiming in. I have a question that I'd love to ask you, Chakaia, and if anyone else in the audience has a question they would like to ask, feel free to raise your hand or send a message in the chat. But Chakaia, you use such a wide variety of different materials as we've been discussing today. And I was wondering if there's a particular medium or particular material that kind of feels the most intuitive or comfortable for you to work with. Not necessarily your favorite, but just kind of what feels the most natural and the most at home.
I think any material that I can get my hands on is something that can become familiar. So it's not a favorite one or the other. It's just that when you do have materials, it just just depends on how much of it that you have that will determine what you can make with it. And so with keeping that in mind, if there's a zillion of the stuff of whatever that might be, then there's more options and choices to be able to be creative. So I think that it's just open. There's not one versus the other. It's just all about money, time, and space.
Yes. They're all kind of equal in terms of your comfort and
Yes, everything is equal. Again, like I said, even like with the ceramics, I mean, I started working in ceramics with clay back in the 80s, but then because of my space and just the ability to keep up with the equipment and the material itself, that also determines how much time that you can put into what it is you do.
thank you. Thank you so much. We have another question from Carolyn. I think this is going to be our last question before the poetry reading.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you so much, Chakaia, for the conversation. I'm just wondering what is next, if you can share with us, or what kind of at least direction you're thinking of taking materially or conceptually. Yeah, we'd just be excited to hear about what's on the horizon.
Well, I think there's a vocabulary that I created with the various materials that I've worked with. And then the idea and goal would just be to find ways to keep elaborating on those ideas. So every time when there's a piece created, even though it may be something subtle that others may not be able to see, if something happens, it allows me to understand that there's just more that can be created. So I'm just looking for the extension of utilizing the things that I do and whatever else could come, come into play, but just looking for a way to continue the language and the conversation with the materials.
Beautiful way to put it. Thank you so much.
May I just add one thing? So my name is Valentina Branchini. I work with David Nolan at David Nolan Gallery, and I had the immense pleasure to work with Chakaia on this project. And I just wanted to say that what Lynn said about the tenderness, it's something that I think about not only Chakaia's relationship with the material, but also there's some great enormous grace, tenderness, and regal aspects to Chakaia as a person and as an artist that I think also translates in her work. And as an Italian person who was trained in art history in Italy, I also love how her work for every person lends itself for the various suggestions. And for me, when I see Chakaia's installation here at the gallery, my mind goes back to the Italian Renaissance and Mantegna and his laurel leaves, garlands, or his Parnassus painting. So I find that is also so mind-blowing. And I thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Valentina. And we just got actually one more question from an audience member, and going to give Jacqueline the opportunity to unmute just before we go to poetry. It's a great question.
Okay.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could talk a little.
We hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? Okay, I'm sorry. I accidentally touched the
We
phone.
don't see you. We can't see you, but we hear you.
Okay, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your process and the technical aspects, of shaping these beautiful tire sculptures. Like, what kind of tools do you use, and how do you actually go about the doing and the making of it?
Well, I work out every day.
Very clear.
Easy. If we worked out every day, maybe we also could make sculpture out of time. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. And a huge thanks again to Chakaia and David and Phil and Tom and Leanne. It's been such a lovely conversation, and thanks Valentina as well. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and today I'm so excited to welcome our Poet Laureate of the day, Taonga Leslie, to the stage. Taonga Leslie is a Black queer poet and lawyer based in Brooklyn, whose poetry explores themes of alienation, transcendence, and self-discovery. His debut illustrated chapbook, A New Road, is available from Blurb, and his poetry has also appeared in Revista Trauma Badok and The Red Wheelbarrow. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, everybody. Lovely to be here and beautiful talk, and lovely to learn more about Chakaia's work. I am pasting a link to my first chapbook in the chat, and I'm going to share 3 poems with you today. I don't know how to talk about my Blackness. I didn't figure it out in time to apply for that fellowship. I didn't figure it out in time for Juneteenth or that reading on Black joy. I didn't get one salvageable poem out of BLM, if you can believe that. I don't know how to think about my Blackness. Is it a black dog that comes when it's called? Is it like Peter Pan's shadow, something I can unstitch? Or is it like Teflon, something I can unstick? It seems to slide right off me. I don't know how to talk about the nothingness where my Blackness should be. The conversation about my comatose body that my mind has absented itself from. My mind crosses the universe and comes back, crosses the universe and comes back about 1,000 times before I realize you're still talking about me. Maybe these 30 years have been a gesture. I'll be Black if you'll be Black, or you'll be white. But deep down, I think this is only my avatar, a costume I'll be zipping out of, the reality of my eternal being barely peeking through. Before I leave here, I'd like to feel my Blackness. I'd like to love my Blackness. I'd like to make peace with my Blackness. I wait for my Blackness to come home every night, watching from the stoop as the street lamps come on. I want to tell it, it's forgiven. I wish that I could have seen you as my brother. Not in the ersatz way that jangles when the bald man with an earring tries to shake me down at the offering plate, or the locked up man behind the barber's chair asks me how to beat the charges. I wish that I could have seen you as my brother, which means I wish I hadn't ever felt a man like you pin my arms behind my head and spit. I wish that I could have seen you as my brother, by which I mean my actual brother, that after bedtime, it would be me sitting at the foot of your bed, staring at the ceiling, asking how they hurt you, not asking how you hurt them, letting your sins slide quiet into the pool of silence as I let theirs so often go. I wish that I could have seen you as my father, or in my father, as in my mother, your hand so like her serving hand. I wish that I could have seen you as my lover, by which I mean I wish I could have seen you as myself, and not been at battle with myself, with you at battle with the world. I wish the world were an open field, not in need of walls or archers, where I, seeing you coming at a gallop, would not reach for my sword. And I wish that softness were rewarded. If I were not already ready for the dagger, what else could you have slipped between my ribs, behind my heart, beneath my blood? One goes out into the world, certain of community. It took New York to prove that there is only me. But sometimes in the shower, with hands in my hair and steam in my eyes, I believe I am like anyone. I go to soap my thighs and smile, a little smile that's only mine. Thank you.
Thank you so, so much. Those were absolutely beautiful and a really, really wonderful way to conclude today. Thank you. And of course, again, thank you to Chakaia, David, Phil, Leanne, and Tom. And thank you to Valentina and the team at David Nolan Gallery for supporting and preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program to make these daily conversations possible, and for supporting our archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through a monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Nancy Brooks Brody, Joy Episaya, Carrie Yamaoka, Zoe Leonard, and Jill Cassett on the event of Expose at Palais de Tokyo in Paris. We'll conclude with a reading by Svetlana Kito. And please now join me in turning on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave today. Enjoy the sunshine. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Everybody.
much.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a great day and go see the show. Thanks, everyone.
Great poetry.
Bye. Thank you.